The air of Rome in the summer of 67 AD shimmered with heat and grandeur. The streets pulsed with life, merchants crying out the price of olives, sandal makers hammering leather beneath shaded awnings, senators borne aloft in gilded litters, while the scent of incense and sweat hung thick over the marble avenues. The eternal city glowed in gold and blood, its power unmatched, its soul restless. Amid this orchestration of empire, one figure moved through the crowd like the sun itself, the Emperor Nero. Draped in robes dyed Tyrian purple, the color reserved only for gods and rulers. He was surrounded by Praetorian guards whose bronze armor caught the sunlight like liquid fire. Yet, what silenced the marketplace that day wasn't Nero's presence alone. It was who walked beside him. A woman veiled in silks of sapphire and ivory, her every motion calculated grace, her jewels glittering with captured light. She was beauty made flesh. And yet, for those who dared look too long, something was profoundly wrong. An echo of familiarity that made hearts shudder. The whispers began to rise like smoke. "It's him. It's Sporus." They said Nero was a performer before he was an emperor, that his heart beat not for conquest but for spectacle. Even his public appearances were carefully staged theater. Yet beneath the applause of the masses and the perfume of adoration, his mind had begun to unravel. Power had made him divine in his own eyes, and divinity demands worship, not truth. In those early days of his reign, Rome had adored him. At 16, he had been the golden boy of the empire. Handsome, poetic, a ruler who spoke to the people and promised a gentler age. He opened the granaries, reduced taxes, and staged festivals where the poor danced beneath torchlight while musicians played lyres until dawn. The empire sang his name. But as the years passed, the melody soured. Rome began to feel the tightening grip of a ruler who mistook love for control and applause for devotion. Nero had surrounded himself with mirrors, each reflecting only what he wished to see. It was in this golden age turned gilded cage that he met her, Poppaea Sabina. To Rome, she was perfection sculpted in mortal form. Hair the color of burnished gold, eyes like polished amber, and a smile that promised both pleasure and peril. But beneath that serenity lived a mind sharper than any senator's. Poppaea knew the empire's true currency wasn't gold or blood. It was influence. She had it, and she knew how to wield it. She had risen from noble birth but wielded her beauty as a blade, cutting a path straight to Nero's heart. When they met, the young emperor was already restless, trapped in a marriage to the meek and politically useless Octavia. Poppaea entered his life like a storm, alluring, dangerous, impossible to ignore. Within months, she became not merely his mistress, but his obsession. Rome began to whisper. The emperor's will was no longer his own. At first, their love burned like incense, intoxicating, sweet, and all-consuming. Nero paraded Poppaea through the streets, draped her in pearls, and declared her the empress of his heart long before the Senate recognized her as such. She whispered advice in his ear, and policy bent to her words. Statues of her likeness began to appear beside his across the city. The people adored her beauty but feared her ambition. Some said she smiled too easily when enemies vanished. Others swore they saw Nero's moods change with her tone, like a puppet pulled by silk strings. The palace glittered with gold and laughter, but in the silence of the night, its corridors echoed with jealousy and control. Nero's love, once tender, curdled into possession. The empire's heart beat beneath the marble arches of Rome, but its soul was slowly darkening. Nero's performances grew more erratic. Nights where he sang on stage while senators were forced to applaud until their palms bled. Mornings where accusations of treason sent nobles to the executioner's block. Yet through it all, Poppaea remained untouchable, the flame he could not live without. She was the mirror that reflected his imagined greatness. But mirrors can shatter, and when they do, the shards cut deep. Love in the palace of Nero was not love as mortals knew it. It was theater, a performance bathed in torchlight, scripted by fear and desire. Poppaea Sabina learned early that to survive in Nero's world, one must act even when the curtain never fell. When she smiled at him, The empire sighed in relief. When she frowned, senators vanished overnight. The marble corridors of the Palatine Hill echoed not with footsteps but with whispers. She rules through him. Yet for all her cunning, even Poppaea could not see how deeply Nero's admiration was turning to possession. He watched her the way an artist watches a masterpiece, not to love it but to ensure it never changes. At banquets, he demanded she sit beside him upon a throne of ivory, their fingers interlaced as musicians played hymns to Venus. Courtiers raised jeweled goblets to toast them. The divine pair of Rome, beauty and power entwined. But beneath the music lurked silence, a brittle quiet that cracked when the emperor's mood shifted. A careless compliment toward another woman, a jest at his singing voice, a delayed glance. Any of these could ignite the fuse. Poppaea began to measure every word, every breath, like a prisoner counting steps in her cell. Still she stayed, because leaving Nero was not an act of disobedience, it was a death sentence. Outside the palace walls, Rome glittered with prosperity, but inside, cracks spread like veins through marble. Nero's paranoia grew, poisoners in every shadow, plots in every conversation. Poppaea's calm counsel once soothed him. Now it seemed to provoke suspicion. When she advised mercy, he heard mockery. When she stayed silent, he imagined betrayal. He began to speak of omens, of crows circling his garden, of ghosts haunting his theater. His servants watched him pace the halls barefoot at night, muttering to invisible audiences, rehearsing tragedies only he could see. One summer evening, Poppaea confronted him. He had returned late from the chariot races, dust and sweat staining his robes, eyes wild with triumph. She scolded him, not as an empress, but as a wife who had grown tired of the spectacle. "Is Rome your stage?" she asked. "Or your kingdom?" The question struck like lightning. Nero's pride, fragile as glass, shattered. His rage came swift and wordless, a storm breaking over marble floors. The chronicles differ on what followed. Some say a single furious kick to her belly, others a prolonged assault in blind fury. What is certain is that Poppaea fell, her cry echoing off the gilded ceiling as servants fled in terror. The empress who once commanded Rome now lay broken by the man who called her his goddess. When the rage subsided, horror took its place. Nero knelt beside her, his hands trembling as he whispered her name again and again, calling for physicians, priests, anyone who could undo what he had done. Poppaea's breath came shallow and fading. The child she carried would never draw air. In that moment, the emperor of the world wept like a lost boy. Witnesses said he tried to command her to live, as if his voice still held the authority of the gods. But no decree could raise the dead. By dawn, the empress was gone, leaving only silence. A silence so absolute that even the fountains in the courtyard seemed to hold their breath. Rome awoke to mourning draped in gold. The emperor ordered a funeral unlike any other. A procession of white doves released into a sky veiled with incense smoke, her body laid with an alabaster carved like the petals of a rose. Poets sang of her beauty, sculptors immortalized her face in marble, and yet none dared whisper the truth of her death. Nero declared her a goddess, her temples filled with offerings and perfumed candles. But behind closed doors, the emperor wandered her empty chambers, clutching her robes, speaking to her as if she might answer. Grief, when mixed with guilt, becomes something monstrous. In the weeks that followed, Nero withdrew from public life. He stopped performing, stopped eating, and forbade music in the palace, for every note reminded him of her laughter. He spent nights alone in the imperial gardens, staring into the dark reflection of the fountains. It was said that one night he saw a shape beside him in the water, a slender figure, with the same delicate eyes, the same graceful face, and for a fleeting moment he believed Poppaea had returned. The figure was not a ghost, but a boy named Sporus. Rome slept uneasily after Poppaea's death. The market still bustled, the senators still debated, but an invisible fog hung over the empire, the sense that the gods had turned their gaze away. Within the marble labyrinth of the Palatine Palace, Emperor Nero wandered like a specter. His once flawless face had hollowed. His eyes, once aflame with ambition, now smoldered with grief. He ordered the palace draped in black silk and refused the light of day. The fountains were silenced, the musicians dismissed. The same city that had crowned him divine now whispered that the emperor conversed with the dead. In the stillness of those nights, Nero spoke to shadows. Servants swore they heard him murmuring to Poppaea's empty bed, calling her by name, promising that she would rise again if Rome continued to love him. The emperor began collecting every object that had once touched her. Her hairpins, her sandals, even the glass cups from which she had sipped wine. He built a private shrine in her former chambers and adorned it with roses, pearls, and candles that burned day and night. Yet even surrounded by her relics, he could not escape the truth that she was gone. Grief turned inward, seeking a vessel. Then came the day Nero saw Sporus clearly for the first time. The boy was barely 15, a former servant freed from imperial slavery for his quiet diligence. He carried scrolls through the corridors with downcast eyes, his features delicate, his skin pale as carved marble. When Nero's gaze fell upon him, time seemed to halt. The emperor dismissed the attendants, drew closer, and studied the youth's face. The curve of the cheek, the soft mouth, the long lashes. It was as if Poppaea's spirit had been reborn in flesh. To any sane man, it was coincidence. To Nero, it was revelation. That night, Nero summoned his physicians and whispered commands that froze their blood. The emperor, he said, had found a way to restore his lost empress. Sporus would become her, not in spirit alone but in form. What began as madness soon became decree. Rome's finest surgeons were brought in secret to the palace. They were ordered to reshape the boy's body, to erase all traces of manhood. The act was unspeakable, yet none dared refuse. In a world where the emperor's word was law, silence was survival. Torches flickered against the stone as the preparations began, and outside, the Tiber carried the moon's reflection like a blade of silver. The procedure itself vanished from official record, mercy perhaps or shame, but every whisper agreed it was cruel beyond imagination. Sporus was cut, reshaped, and remade under the emperor's will. For weeks he drifted between fever and delirium, his youth stolen by pain. When he awoke, attendants dressed him in silks the color of dawn and brought him before a mirror framed in gold. The reflection that stared back was neither boy nor woman, but something in between, fragile, tragic, and strangely divine. Nero stood behind him, eyes wet with triumph and madness. "My Sabina," he murmured, calling him by Poppaea's name. Thus began the emperor's resurrection of illusion. Sporus was taught to walk as Poppaea had walked, slow, poised, divine. Tutors instructed him in the language of court ladies, in laughter that concealed sorrow, in gestures of submission. Seamstresses tailored gowns to his altered form, using the very patterns once worn by the dead empress. Jewelers refitted Poppaea's necklaces around his slender neck. Perfumers recreated her favorite scent of myrrh and rose. Each day erased a piece of Sporus's past until only Sabina remained. The boy who had been born free of history was now enslaved by it. At dawn, when Sporus first appeared before the imperial court, Rome gasped. The resemblance was terrifying. Senators and courtiers bowed as the emperor introduced his bride returned from the heavens. The empire's greatest illusionist had outdone himself. Some whispered prayers in fear, others forced applause. Nero smiled through tears as music filled the hall. In that moment, power, grief, and delusion fused into one, and a broken boy became the mirror of a dead goddess. The transformation of Sporus into Poppaea's shadow became the empire's most guarded secret, and its most exquisite horror. In the gilded silence of Nero's palace, time itself seemed to dissolve. Servants walked barefoot down corridors lined with mirrors so the emperor could admire his creation from every angle. Music returned to the palace, but it was not joyous. Flutes played softly through the night, echoing melodies Poppaea once loved. Sporus moved through it all like a phantom. Painted lips, jeweled fingers, eyes that never met another's gaze. When he smiled, courtiers smiled back, but behind their eyes flickered terror. For they knew, what pleased Nero lived, and what displeased him vanished. To the people of Rome, rumors began to drift like incense smoke from forbidden rooms. They whispered of an emperor who had conquered even death, who had raised his lost love in another's body. Some dismissed it as madness, others as proof of divine power. But within the palace, Sporus lived a life of ritual and fear. Each morning began with attendants dressing him in silks dyed with imported indigo, weaving Poppaea's old jewels into his hair. Each evening ended with a private banquet beside Nero, the emperor gazing across the table as though the years had rewound and death had been undone. Every glance from him was both adoration and imprisonment. Sporus rarely spoke. The sound of his voice seemed to startle him, as if it belonged to someone else. Tutors continued to mold him into Nero's fantasy, teaching gestures of Roman nobility, the way to pour wine with a curved wrist, the way to enter a room with grace and quiet authority. His laughter was rehearsed, his silence punished. He learned to mimic Poppaea's tilt of the head, the subtle lowering of her gaze when addressed by senators. To the emperor it was perfection, to Sporus it was erasure. Each lesson took something that had once been his and replaced it with something that was hers. One afternoon, Nero led Sporus to Poppaea's old chamber, the one sealed since her death. Dust and silence had ruled there, but now, under torchlight, it was reborn. The emperor had ordered it restored to how it had been in her final days. Rose petals scattered upon the floor, curtains drawn with golden tassels, the faint scent of perfume resurrected from her vial. He took Sporus by the hand and whispered, "You belong here." The words hung heavy, neither comfort nor command, but prophecy. From that night on, Sporus slept in Poppaea's bed, surrounded by her memory, haunted by her absence. As months passed, Nero's illusion became Rome's spectacle. He began appearing publicly with Sporus, veiled, radiant, dressed in imperial garments. At first, the city held its breath in disbelief. Then obedience followed. Senators bowed to Sporus as they once bowed to Poppaea. Priests offered blessings. The theater erupted with cheers whenever Nero entered holding his bride's hand. The line between love and delusion vanished. Sporus had become a living myth, the proof that power could twist even grief into ceremony. In the privacy of the palace, Nero's affection shifted like the sea, calm one moment, violent the next. He adorned Sporus with gold, fed him grapes and honeyed wine, but his praise could turn to fury without warning. Once, during a feast, Nero accused him of not smiling as Poppaea once had. He demanded he try again. The guests watched in silence as Sporus, trembling, forced the perfect imitation. Nero's rage softened instantly, tears welling as he whispered, "Yes, that's her." The court erupted in applause, masking the collective horror. To the senators and slaves who served him, Sporus was no longer a person. He was a mirror that reflected the emperor's madness. They addressed him as Lady Sabina and never dared to use his true name. In rare moments of solitude, he would stand before the mirror and stare at the stranger within. The face was beautiful, flawless, divine, but behind the painted eyes flickered despair. He had become the ghost of someone else's love story, condemned to play a role in a play that never ended. When whispers reached the city that the emperor planned something unprecedented, a public wedding, Rome braced itself. Nero would not merely love his illusion in secret. He would sanctify it before the gods. Invitations were sent to senators, generals, and foreign dignitaries. The temples were adorned, the streets cleaned, the air heavy with incense. The emperor would marry Sporus, not as man to man, but as god to goddess, master to creation. It was the final act of a tragedy disguised as triumph. The morning of the wedding dawned like a vision torn from myth. Rome awoke to the echo of trumpets and the scent of burning myrrh drifting through its marble streets. Thousands gathered along the sacred way, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and unease. The emperor had decreed a celebration unlike any other, the union of Nero, ruler of the world, and the woman reborn from death. But those who had heard the whispers knew the truth. The bride was not a woman at all. Beneath the veil of pearls and silk was Sporus, the boy who had been remade in the image of the empress. Still, no one dared to speak it aloud. For today, Rome itself would kneel before the emperor's illusion. The palace gates opened, and the procession began. Soldiers of the Praetorian Guard marched first, their armor flashing like mirrors of fire. Behind them came priests bearing golden bowls of sacred flame, followed by musicians with lyres and flutes, whose melody wove through the air like incense. At the heart of it all rode Nero, his robe embroidered with constellations in thread of gold, and beside him, the figure of his bride, radiant and silent beneath a cascade of jewels. The crowd erupted into applause, though fear dulled every cheer. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as the emperor's chariot passed. Inside the palace, the air shimmered with torchlight. Every surface glowed, from the mosaics beneath their feet to the golden statues that lined the walls. The ceremony was to take place in the Hall of Apollo, where frescoes of gods and heroes watched from the ceiling. Sporus walked beside Nero, his steps light, practiced, perfect. His hands trembled beneath layers of silk, but his face betrayed nothing. He had learned well that masks were safer than truth. When they reached the altar, Nero turned to him with eyes shining not with cruelty but with something more terrifying, love twisted beyond recognition. The ceremony began with sacred vows drawn from Rome's ancient rites. A priest intoned the words to Venus and Mars, asking the gods to bless the union. Nero repeated each phrase solemnly, his voice echoing through the marble hall. When Sporus's turn came, his voice quavered, soft, uncertain, almost a whisper. But the emperor smiled as though hearing the song of the heavens. He took Sporus's hand, placed a ring of emerald upon it, and declared, "Let the world witness love restored." The court erupted into applause, and the musicians struck their chords. The illusion was complete. The feast that followed rivaled any in Rome's history. Tables overflowed with figs, roasted pheasants, honeyed wines, and silver platters of oysters from the sea. Dancers in flowing robes twirled beneath chandeliers of crystal, while Nero and his empress sat side by side upon an ivory dais. The emperor raised his goblet and proclaimed, "Love conquers even death." The words echoed through the hall like prophecy, and yet beneath the laughter and music, a current of dread ran deep. For all its splendor, every guest understood they were watching tragedy dressed in silk. Sporus sat motionless as the celebration roared around him. He smiled when Nero smiled, drank when Nero drank, and danced when Nero beckoned. Yet within him, something fragile was fading. Every toast to Sabina reborn was another nail in the coffin of the boy he had once been. He remembered his real name only in dreams. Dreams where he still ran barefoot through sunlit courtyards, nameless and free. Now he was a statue painted in flesh, adored and imprisoned all at once. When the night grew late, Nero led his new bride to the balcony overlooking the city. The moon hung low over the Tiber, its reflection breaking upon the water like shattered glass. Rome lay silent below, unaware that its emperor's madness had reached divine proportions. Nero wrapped his arms around Sporus and whispered, "Now she lives again." His tears fell upon the silk veil as Sporus stood still, neither resisting nor embracing. For in that moment, the boy realized the terrible truth. He was not loved, only remembered. And so the emperor slept peacefully that night, believing himself redeemed by love. But within the palace walls, servants whispered prayers for Sporus's soul. For even gods, they said, could not raise the dead without damning the living. The months after the wedding unfolded like a fading opera. The music still played, but its notes no longer carried joy, only echo. Nero's empire, once drenched in gold, began to crack beneath the weight of neglect and indulgence. Treasury coffers emptied, soldiers went unpaid, and whispers of rebellion spread across the provinces. Yet within the marble walls of the palace, Nero remained blind to it all. His days were consumed by performances, banquets, and adoration of the fragile figure he called his empress. Sporus followed him everywhere, to the theater, to the circus, even to the Senate. Always dressed in silks, always silent, always smiling. To the people of Rome, he was no longer a mystery. He was a symbol of everything wrong with their emperor. Beyond the palace gates, Rome seethed. Fires smoldered in alleyways, bread grew scarce, and soldiers began to murmur the unthinkable, that the emperor had lost the favor of the gods. Governors in distant provinces refused orders, and uprisings erupted like sparks from dry wood. Still, Nero performed as if the world were his stage. In one of his final public appearances, he sang of eternal love before an audience forced to applaud, tears streaking his painted face. At his side, Sporus stood as always, his expression unreadable, his presence ghostly. The emperor's grief had become Rome's curse. But even illusions have limits. The senators who once bowed began to plot in silence. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's iron shield, turned brittle with resentment. When word arrived that the General Galba had declared rebellion in Hispania, panic rippled through the court. Nero summoned his advisors, yet none came. Fear had hollowed his throne. Only Sporus remained beside him, the last echo of devotion in an empire of betrayal. Nero clasped his hand and whispered, "They would not dare touch a god," but his voice trembled as thunder rolled outside. The gods, it seemed, had stopped listening. Within days, chaos consumed the capital. Soldiers deserted, senators fled, and the Senate branded Nero a public enemy. A sentence of death without trial. The emperor's palace, once the heart of Rome's magnificence, became a tomb of echoing corridors. Nero, terrified and trembling, discarded his robes of gold for a simple tunic and fled under cover of night with a handful of loyal servants. Sporus went with him, veiled even in flight, carrying nothing but the jewelry Nero insisted he keep. The road ahead was lined with betrayal. Behind them, the empire burned. They hid in a small villa on the outskirts of the city, a crumbling estate surrounded by olive trees and silence. There, stripped of his throne, Nero faced the only truth he had ever feared. He was mortal. His laughter turned to muttering, his songs to prayers. He pressed Sporus's hands to his lips and begged forgiveness. For Rome, for Poppaea, for everything. "Without you," he whispered, "there is no me." But Sporus could only stare, hollow and exhausted. The emperor who once commanded legions now clung to a shadow of his own making. As dawn broke, news reached them. The Senate soldiers were coming. Nero's followers scattered, urging him to flee east or take his life before capture. Panic twisted his features as he searched the faces around him. But only Sporus remained. "Will they tear me apart?" Nero asked. The boy, who had endured more than words could hold, finally spoke. "They will not touch a god," he said, repeating Nero's own delusion back to him, his tone flat, merciful. For the first time, Nero smiled. When the soldiers' hoofbeats thundered in the distance, Nero turned to the dagger he had long avoided. "The world will not see me fall," he muttered. Trembling, he looked to Sporus and asked, "Will you weep for me?" The boy nodded once. With a final breath, the emperor pressed the blade to his throat, but his courage failed. It was a servant who guided the steel home. As Nero collapsed, Sporus knelt beside him, his face unreadable, his silks stained crimson. "Too late," the boy whispered, though whether in grief or release, no one knew. The last emperor of the Julio-Claudian line died in a whisper, and with him the illusion he had forced upon the world. For Rome, Nero's death was liberation. For Sporus, it was exile. The empire he had once glided through in silk now regarded him as a cursed relic, the remnant of a madness best forgotten. Yet history would not forget him. He carried the emperor's shadow like a chain that no death could break. After Nero's death, Rome exhaled. A long, collective breath of relief after years of suffocation. But for Sporus, that breath turned to smoke. The boy who had lived as an emperor's dream now found himself a prisoner of history. Once, his name had been whispered in awe and fear. Now it was spat in contempt. To many, he was a living reminder of Rome's shame, of the emperor who had loved a reflection and the youth who had become it. The new rulers of the empire treated him not as a person, but as a curiosity, a possession passed from one victor to the next. His silks were torn away, his jewels confiscated, but his beauty remained, and that was his curse. He was first claimed by Nymphidius Sabinus, commander of the Praetorian Guard, a man whose ambition burned brighter than his mercy. Sabinus paraded Sporus through banquets as though he were a trophy taken from a fallen god. "Behold," he would say, "the ghost who tamed an emperor." The laughter of his guests cut through the boy like blades. Sporus played the role he had been forced into, smiling faintly, eyes lowered, speaking only when spoken to. But behind that silence lay a growing resolve. For the first time, he began to see that his obedience had kept him alive, but it had also chained him to his tormentors. When Sabinus fell in a power struggle, Sporus was handed to another, Otho, a man who had once been Nero's ally and rival. Ironically, Otho treated him with surprising gentleness. Perhaps it was pity, or perhaps the ghost of Nero's memory haunted him too. He clothed Sporus once again in silk and called him Sabina, as the emperor had done. But the kindness was hollow, a resurrection of the same illusion, dressed in softer cruelty. Sporus accepted it not from devotion, but from exhaustion. Each gesture, each word of affection, reminded him of his cage. Then came Vitellius, coarse, cruel, and insatiable. Under his rule, Rome's decadence turned grotesque. Vitellius took Sporus not as a companion, but as a spectacle. He forced him to appear in public once more, dressed as a bride, laughing before senators and soldiers alike. "Let Rome see what gods their emperor worshipped," he sneered. But humiliation was not enough. Vitellius planned a final performance, a mock play in the amphitheater where Sporus would play the role of a doomed maiden violated and murdered by beasts, a parody of Nero's tragedy come full circle. The night before the spectacle, Sporus was left alone in his chambers, the scent of iron and jasmine heavy in the air. For the first time in years, no one guarded him. He walked to the polished bronze mirror that hung upon the wall, the same kind Nero had once made him face after the transformation. The reflection staring back was older now, thinner, haunted. The painted mask of Poppaea had faded, revealing not the boy he had been, but someone in between, neither man nor woman, neither slave nor free. "You were never her," he whispered to his reflection, voice steady for the first time. "You were me." When dawn crept through the shutters, Sporus made his final choice. He refused to let the world watch him die as entertainment. Before the guards arrived to drag him to the arena, he drank from a small vial hidden among his perfumes. Poison, silent and merciful. By the time the door burst open, he was lying peacefully upon his bed, eyes closed, a faint smile on his lips. For the first time in years, he looked free. In that stillness, the illusion broke, not with violence but with grace. The boy who had been turned into a ghost reclaimed the only thing Nero could never control: his own ending. Rome buried his name in silence. No monument was raised, no poem recited. Yet the story of Sporus endured, whispered among historians and poets as a warning that power, when left unchecked, devours the souls of both ruler and ruled. In the centuries that followed, his memory drifted like a ghost through the corridors of history, nameless yet unforgettable. For though emperors fall and empires fade, the suffering of one human heart, crushed beneath the weight of another's madness, remains eternal. History rarely remembers its victims with the same devotion it gives its tyrants. Nero's name still thunders through marble halls, etched in statues, in poems, in fire. But Sporus, the quiet ghost who bore his grief, survived only in the margins of dusty scrolls. To the chroniclers of Rome, he was a footnote, an oddity, a rumor wrapped in silk. Yet if one listens closely between the lines, a heartbeat still lingers, a fragile echo of a boy who lived and died for another man's delusion. And in that echo lies Rome's true tragedy, that beneath the empire's gold, every triumph hid a story of someone broken to make it shine. Power, in its purest form, is not the crown or the sword. It is the ability to shape another's reality, to bend a soul until it reflects one's own desires. Nero had wielded that power like a god, believing he could conquer death through beauty, through art, through cruelty disguised as love. But in the end, the empire he built on performance crumbled like plaster beneath rain. For every empire born from vanity, history keeps a mirror, and when the light changes, it shows what was truly there. Not glory, but fear. If Sporus' story endures, it is because it exposes the cost of worshipping false gods, of confusing love with ownership, creation with control. He was not the Empress reborn, nor the instrument of divine tragedy. He was the proof that even within an empire of marble and flame, humanity is fragile, fleeting, and sacred. His life reminds us that cruelty often wears the mask of beauty, and that sometimes survival itself becomes an act of quiet rebellion. Centuries have passed since the fires of Rome dimmed, yet the story still feels modern. For every age births its own Neros, men who mistake power for purpose and devotion for obedience. And in every age there are those like Sporus, whose pain becomes invisible beneath another's legend. Perhaps that is why the tale continues to haunt us, because it is not just ancient history, but a reflection of what we still are. So when you stand before the ruins of the Palatine Hill, when you trace the worn marble where emperors once walked, remember not the crown, but the silence that followed it. For within that silence sleeps the memory of a boy who was never meant to be a legend, but became one nonetheless. And perhaps, somewhere beyond the reach of power and pain, he is finally what he was denied in life: free.